Hello everyone, my name is Daan and this is Fleur. We are both economics students. This is our professor, Mr. Schram. For our international economics project, we chose the topic structural reforms, and more specifically the structural reforms that were imposed on Greece. In this video, we aim to answer the question whether or not the structural reforms imposed on Greece were beneficial to them. So here we go. In the coming 15 minutes, you'll be learning everything you need to know about structural reforms and what exactly happened in the case of Greece. First of all, we're going to dive into the complicated and unknown world of structural reforms. Benefits and drawbacks and effects will be discussed. Hereafter, the Greek sovereign debt crisis of 2010 will be briefly introduced. How did it come to escalate like this? For this, we will take a look at the timeline of the crisis, the major events and the responses. Why did the IMF, ECB and the EC chose to apply a best practices, one-size-fits-all policy to this case? And what were the effects of choosing this universal policy, rather than one that is more specific and personalized to the Greek case? And finally, what lessons could be drawn from the Greek case? Let's start with a timeline to get a rough overview of the Greece case. In 2008, the financial crisis hits both the US and Europe. A year later, in 2009, Greece's accounting unravels. It becomes known that Greece's budget deficit is far higher than the country had let on. In 2010, the crisis spreads. Austerity measures are adopted. Greece and Ireland are bailed out. In 2011, the crisis deepens. A permanent rescue fund is planned as European leaders look for resolution. 2012 is all about containing the crisis. Countries and banks struggle to get balance sheets under control. Empty ATMs, thousands of people unemployed, pensioners struggling to cope with their severely lowered incomes, and workers doing their best to still put food on the table besides paying the increased taxes. In short, the Greek sovereign debt crisis of 2010. The situation related to the financial crisis in 2007 and 8, but one that escalated quicker than many had expected. One of the reasons for this was the undercounting of the Greek financial debt levels and deficits. On the 20th of October in 2009, the new finance minister, George Papakonstantinou, admitted the debt levels to be 13.6%, rather than the previously announced 3.6% of the GDP. And how is this possible? Well, one of the reasons was the Greek using a loan of Goldman Sachs as a form of revenue in their financial reports, something the other countries had no knowledge about. This resulted in a crumbling of trust in the Greek government and their institutions, most of which started showing their weaknesses at this time as well. In addition, the lowering credibility of Greek financial data became problematic for investors, as well as leading to many international institutions downgrading Greek assets to a junk status. However, Greece's financial position in 2009 was still not that unique, as other countries like Portugal, Spain and Malta were also coping with growing deficits at the time. Nevertheless, some key points of difference were the very high levels of Greek debt and Greece's financial forecast, which expected debt levels to rise up to 150% of the GDP in 2013. As a result, a bailout plan was essential for avoiding Greece's bankruptcy. Of course, a plan like this is normally only used as a last resort, and Greece would have to do its part as well. In other words, the IMF, the EC and the ECB set the terms and conditions for this rescue deal of about 240 billion euros, in which a third would be paid by the IMF and the other two-thirds by the other EU states, if all be willing to do so. Nevertheless, this money only gave Greece the chance to pay the interest on its loans and to keep its banks capitalized, leaving the Greek with empty hands. In 2011, the European Financial Stability Facility added another 190 billion to the bailout, money that also came from the EU countries. Combined with bondholders agreeing to sell their bonds 75% below their value, and another loan of the European Stability Mechanism of 7.5 billion, and yet another one of 86 billion from the EU. All of this under the condition of Greece implementing the austerity measures or structural reforms the creditors demanded to be taken. In August 2018, the bailout program is scheduled to end, but Greece will not escape this strict supervision by its creditors just yet. The expectations for now are that 75% of Greece's debt will be repaid by 2060. However, there is a lot of skepticism about this prediction of the EC, as many argue Greece's debt being far too great to ever pay off. So what exactly are structural reforms? According to the European Central Bank, structural reforms are essentially measures that change the fabric of an economy, meaning that structural reforms change the institutional and regulatory framework in which businesses and people operate. Structural reforms are designed to ensure that the economy is fit and better able to realize its growth potential in a balanced way. Structural reforms mainly work on the supply side of the economy, by tackling obstacles to the efficient and fair production of goods and services. Hereby they should help increase productivity, investment, and employment. Structural reforms can be targeted at specific sectors, such as those encouraging innovation in key industries. According to the European Central Bank, structural reforms are important for future growth in Europe and for strengthening the economic and monetary union. The theory behind structural reforms is quite simple. Opening the economy to competition will increase the efficiency with which resources are allocated. Open up regulated professions, pharmacies, notaries, and taxicabs, for example, and inefficient suppliers will be driven out by more productive firms. Privatize state enterprises, and the new management will rationalize production. These changes do not directly induce economic growth, but they increase the economy's potential, or long-run income. Growth itself occurs as the economy begins to converge to this higher level of long-run income. Despite the prevailing consensus that structural reforms would generate long-term growth benefits, in the recent past only a few countries have embarked in major reform efforts. The four main areas of reform are the labor market, the product market, the business environment, and barriers to foreign direct investment. A large set of factors could impact the likelihood of implementing structural reforms, both relating to the domestic and external forces. The initial structural conditions of a country constitute an important driver for structural reforms. Domestic forces include the current state of economic structures and underlying regulations, macroeconomic conditions, fiscal and monetary policies, and the general political environment. External forces, on the other hand, include, for example, being subject to a financial assistance program, which facilitates reform implementation. Structural reform implementation, in particular in labor markets, is more likely during deep recessions and when unemployment rates are high. When a country is expected to have high potential growth in the future, the pressure for reform seems to be reduced. Examples of reforms that were put in place were the creation of the FSF, the Financial Stability Fund, reduction of pension expenditures, implementation of anti-evasion plan to restore tax discipline, but also the overall increase of tax levels, promoting of privatization and restructuring employment in the government sector, and creation of a single payment authority responsible for public wages. Furthermore, detailed, timely, and accurate reporting of financial data was one of the most basic but simultaneously most valued requirements. As mentioned before, the austerity measures the IMF, the EC, and the ECB held as their conditions for providing financial aid were not drafted specifically for Greece. Rather, they had been used in many different countries before, the results of which were quite varied. So what were the intended outcomes of the structural reforms imposed on Greece? First of all, opening up the economy, but also increasing market efficiency, promoting investment through regulation and monitoring of reported financial data, publication of reports on government activity, and reforms of the labor market. The primary focus was originally on limiting budget overruns and making the country function more efficiently on different levels. In that sense, the term rescue deal very much reflects the main goal of the bailout program, ensuring the survival of the Greek state and on a larger scale, the Eurozone. After Greece's obedient implementation of the first two bailout programs and another less cordial acceptance on the conditions of the third bailout, Greece has repeatedly been judged by the EC, the ECB, and the IMF to be on the right track. This after a severe decrease in real GDP right after realization of the first structural reforms. Unemployment rates have risen up to 30% of the population in 2013, and having taken severe hits in investment and private consumption as well. Perhaps needless to say, the structural reforms were not welcomed very well by the Greek citizens, leading to many protests and other forms of political unrest. However, from 2016 until today, the Greek GDP has been increasing again. This growth amounted up to 1.1% of the first 3 quarters of 2017. Furthermore, the real GDP is expected to grow with 2.5% in 2018 and 19, and in addition, unemployment rates are now below 20% and continue falling, and private consumption is growing. Combined with sustained improvement in the labor market, consumer sentiment is set to fuel private consumption growth in 2018 and after. Consumer price inflation reached 1.1% in 2017, driven by the rebound in energy prices and increases in the indirect taxation. Headline inflation is expected to decrease in 2018 as core inflation looks unlikely to fully compensate for fading base effects linked to the energy prices. Net exports took over as the main driver of growth in the second and third quarters, indicating Greece now also begins to enjoy the benefits of the structural reforms as well as the wider recovery of the European economy. Moreover, robust foreign demand should provide a boost to net exports, which are projected to become an important growth engine in 2018, supporting the economy's reorientation towards the tradable sector. As Danny Roderick argues, the Greek economy might have been less likely to be depressed for as long as it was now, and might even have grown faster if the structural reforms would have been more focused. That is, offering specific solutions to lower-level problems might have been more efficient and sustainable in the sense that other factors would have been taken into account, making the reform a better fit to the issues. This approach also would have allowed for greater focus on the economy's strengths and growth engines for the tradable sector. For example, this sector can be made more profitable through promotion of investment and entrepreneurship in new and existing export activities, improving the CA, the current account, rather than deteriorating it. Furthermore, this would have prevented a severe decline in investment over the past years and the urgent need for a shift of focus now. In short, Roderick's suggestions for structural reforms in Greece would have mitigated the past years of suffering from the Greek sovereign debt crisis while building a better foundation for future growth. To conclude, effects of structural reforms programs all depend on the situation. Like with Greece, the proposed and implemented structural reforms policies were traditional best practices that are used universally for a large variety of cases. However, as mentioned earlier, one size usually does not fit all, and a more targeted recovery and growth policy might have saved Greece years of protests and political unrest. Nevertheless, what's done is done, and at the time the structural reform policy was needed, there were no personalized plans in place yet. As drafting those on the spot also was not an option, due to all the political implications, the EC, the IMF, and the ECB decided to use what they did have. For the future, though, it might be a good idea to acknowledge the fact that the economic reality is far from perfect and things can go wrong sometimes, despite the preventive measures in place. Investing in clear, customizable rescue strategies that can be adjusted on the go might offer some help in this respect. So, can structural reforms be beneficial to a country when they are imposed on them? The answer is maybe, although honest dialogue is essential for their success sooner or later. That's it. Thank you for watching. We hope you learned something, and for any questions, comments or remarks, we kindly direct you to the comment section. Until next time.